Sup everyone, and today I'm going to be elaborating on a very well-known topic related to Survivor because I love the show. And so for this video, I'm going to be talking about one infamous twist that is a very notorious game mechanic in modern Survivor, which is the forced fire making challenge, which if y'all know, it was a new twist that was first implemented back in Survivor Heroes vs. Healers vs. Hustlers, my first Survivor season, which goes to show how unfortunate that was. So this would become a mandatory twist that would occur at the final 4 round, where the player who won final immunity must take one other player to the end with them and force the other two to face off in a fire-making showdown, where the winner of that will earn the final spot at the end. And this new gimmick has become permanent ever since the Survivor season I had just talked about, and this led to a lot of discourse among the Survivor fanbase because of how much this twist really saps a lot of the entertainment value, and I do have my fair share for it because, let's be real, okay, the final 4 round should usually be an exciting round of gameplay, whereas the final round before the final tribal council, so it renders it very important to determine the trajectory of the endgame, and that helps with a vote, not a twist. And now, because of the new game mechanic, with forced fire making being shoved down our throats, it deprives us from an exciting round of gameplay because the players won't scramble for a vote anymore and instead for a fire making challenge, which I don't really find that exciting. And with this twist being mandatory in the modern seasons, it just becomes repetitive and it just strips away any sense of enjoyment from the final 4 rounds because they're just not determined by the player's strategy, instead by the player's fire-making skills. And this meta here is something that Jeff Probst himself really just encourages, and he has an overt love for this twist because I guess he wants to intensify the stakes a bit, even though it feels like it's being executed all wrongly. But since we're talking about fire making, I think to make things a little interesting, let's run through the history of the fire making challenge where it determined an elimination. So let's run back to the first season that it was introduced in, and that's Survivor Palau, where it actually occurred twice this season. But the first one was under the circumstance of just Oolong being a disastrous tribe where it goes extinct and we're down to the last 2 members, where here a vote won't help because there's only 2, so a fire making showdown, which tests the ability of who has the better skill, determines the boot. And in this situation, I'm okay with the fire making challenge because for the circumstances of the situation here, it's valid and it always feels ripe to be the challenge that determines the elimination. So this is one of those cases where I don't mind it at all. And the same thing would happen later on in the season where it will occur at the final 4 round, but this time the circumstances was that it would be in a situation where a tie occurs, where I think it is somewhat correct to have something like this decide who goes because it's under the circumstances after a vote where the 2 people who were targeted this round face off in an intense showdown that really decides the trajectory of the season depending on who wins. And I think that aspect of the fire making is what makes it more exciting than the one where it's forced, because in that situation, it would occur where there was no vote that commenced. And in contrast to this situation, with there being a vote that occurred, it makes things a lot more interesting, and it also shows us the dynamics between the players coming into it. And that part I do find more interesting. And now because of this game element, there will be many other times in other seasons that a fire making challenge would dictate the round as the tiebreaker. As we see here, it would occur in Survivor Panama, Cook Islands, Gabon, Worlds Apart, and Ko Wrong. We're looking at the list here. Among these seasons, we will see the fire making challenge occur 7 times, with Palau obviously having 2 and the other seasons just having 1 that will be the tiebreakers in the respective final 4 rounds. So even though fire making challenge didn't really appear that often in the franchise, it was still a pretty notable game element that encouraged players to play the final 4 rounds more optimally so they could avoid putting themselves into a fire making situation. Where I do think it's very enjoyable to see the players maneuver their ways around this element. And it's something that I'm glad International Survivor decides to stick with, where in some seasons we do get some crazy Final 4 vote-offs that do involve those crazy 2-1-1 votes, which I find very intriguing, and it's something that I do miss from modern seasons of Survivor US. Which, now talking about it, now let's get into the seasons that involve the forced fire-making challenges. And here we have pretty much every season from the one that first introduced the fire making twist to the present. And pretty much now, since then, every final round would just be determined by the fire making showdown. So there will be no vote that commence. And because of that, it has made the rounds here pretty mundane, because the scramble leading up to the tribal is just the players practicing their fire, which I've already said it is just not very compelling to watch. However, the scope of the fire making challenge has become a pretty influential part in propelling a player's resume, where through the notion of them putting themselves at risk of elimination so that they can earn their spots at the end really seems to gain a lot of respect from the jury, where through the notion of the said player willing to put themselves in fire so they could win the competition to really elevate their resume to make the jury look at them with much higher regard. So that's one key benefit of this twist, is how it can really help prop up a player's jury management. And we've seen in some seasons how that actually worked out for some winners through putting themselves in fire making. And the most notable of them all, obviously from Survivor Edge of Extinction, Chris Underwood, where he had immunity, but he gave it up and put himself into the challenge so that one, he could add another achievement to his resume, and two, be the person who faced off against the biggest player of the season in Rick Devens by taking him out of the game. So really, the upsides for this twist in terms of a player's own right is allowing them to propel their reputation to the jury. And what I had just said here, we see how players utilize this notion so that they could try and elevate their jury management, where scenarios like Chris Underwood and Heidi Lagarius Greenblatt would give up their immunities just to face on in fire against a better player. So that's a very unique aspect of this. But now let's get into one of the bigger downsides of it, in the fact that this twist can really screw over certain players who are primed to make it to the finals had a vote commence instead. For example, someone like, I would say like Teeny from Survivor 47 was definitely apt to be a finalist, but because of the fire making twist, and also through the conditions of the weather severely impacting their fire progress, it really screwed over them a spot at the end, which I mostly find as one of the biggest disappointing things that this twist can cause. And I've seen online a lot how people resent this feature, which I'm on par with that, but it seems like Jeff Probst just doesn't see it like that. He looks at it as a net positive of a twist, where it doesn't seem like he's willing to abolish it anytime soon. And in times where he mentioned that there will be a change with it, like for 46, he would mention that a new change for the fire making twist was that the players would just not be given kits to practice with, which that doesn't change anything. You could just simply take away the twist as a whole, and then things would be much better that way. But no. And to be honest, at this point, I don't really even see the twist even going away soon, because Jeff seems to really adore it, despite its terrible quality and how it's being executed. Where back then, when fire makers were used for tiebreakers, they were definitely more intriguing. So it felt like Survivor wanted to try and bring that back, but the execution of their idea was just all wrong. And it's just led to the standards of modern Survivor, which the twist itself has become very stale because of it. And then one last thing about this twist is the timing when it debuted, because it was first introduced in Survivor Heroes, Healers, Hustlers, which, if you don't know the context of the season, there was a player named Ben who was reliant on idols to avoid elimination, and was the consensus target if he did not have any semblance of immunity. So once he made the Final Four, all he needed was the immunity necklace, and he couldn't earn it, so it felt like he was a dead man walking. However, this stupid twist came in at the wrong time, and it was what Ben needed to survive the Final Four round and make his way to his win. Which, because of the timing of this twist, it stirred a lot of controversy, where people claimed that it was rigged to help Ben win. Which obviously myself, I was really pissed off that Ben won because this twist saved him. And if it was just for this season, then it would entertain more of the idea that the challenge was rigged for him. But now, because it's spread it out to other seasons, it does kind of wane down that theory. So this all pretty much wraps up everything I have to say about the qualities of this forced fire making challenge, and mostly the problems it has been throughout modern Survivor, which is pretty on par with how many of the fan base looks at it as well. So for the final part, I want to do something a little bit interesting here, where I run through all the seasons with the forced fire making twist and talk about the scenarios where had the twist not occur in those rounds and a vote happened instead. So let's start it off with Survivor Heroes versus Healers versus Hustlers, which I think it's pretty self-explanatory what was going to happen. Ben would have been voted out, which dramatically would have changed the result of the season, and it would have been much more better that way, in my opinion. But yeah, pretty much Ben would have been unanimously voted out, since he was the obvious target, where because now Chrissy won the final immunity, he would have no chance of saving himself in a scenario where the twist did not occur. Next is Survivor Ghost Island, And in this scenario, I do think Wendell has locked votes against him from Dominic and Angela. However, I'm still uncertain if Laurel was willing to vote Wendell out. Which one of the biggest downsides with this forced fire-making twist as well is the fact that because we're now focused so much on that part, we never really get a solid idea of how this vote scenario would have went. So we get cases like this season and many more that I'm really not sure how it would have played out. And so here, if I were to think about it, maybe Dominic works his magic and convinces Laurel to vote for Wendell, and so if that Wendell would be unanimously voted out. But however, if Laurel does stay loyal to Wendell, then she and him probably would vote out Angela, and the vote result would be tied, and we would just get the same scenario where it's Wendell versus Angela in the fire-making challenge, with the former winning and earning his spot at the end. Then with Survivor David versus Goliath, it's another one that I'm not 100% sure of. I will say that Mike is definitely on the chopping block because of his threat levels, so there are chances that Nick and Carol will vote for him. Mike would probably just vote for Kara, so it really comes down to whether Angelina flips on him or not. And in this situation, I think Angelina is likely to do so, since she is a player that was very desperate for a resume. So I do think that by taking out Mike, who is one of the biggest threats in the game, could help bolster her resume a bit. So my guess is that she votes alongside Kara and Nick, and therefore Mike is unanimously voted out. Next we got Survivor Edge of Extinction, and come on, it's so easy. Everyone was just gonna vote out Rick Devens. And here, Chris doesn't need to give up his immunity necklace because it's a vote. And they're just gonna straight up take out Devens unanimously. So pretty much he had no shot. Unless he somehow could find a way to get Gavin and Julie to vote for each other, which would be very unlikely. And it would be stupid to do so. So pretty much straightforward, Devens vote off. Then with Survivor Island of the Idols, it's another straightforward case where I think everyone was just gonna vote out Lauren Beck because Tommy looked at her as a threat and planned to take her out once he had the chance, and since he has such influence, Dee and Nora would have just followed his lead and voted out Lauren alongside them, so Lauren pretty much did not have a shot here. She's unanimously voted out. Next is Winners at War, and it's another one that I'm not 100% sure of, but I know that Tony definitely has 2 locked votes against him from Natalie and Michelle. However, Tony has Sarah as an ally, and I'm not certain that she is willing to flip on him despite the threat level he has, so I guess because of the undying loyalty she has, she and Tony would have just voted for Michelle, and then it would have been a fire-making challenge between Michelle and Tony. But if Sarah does flip on Tony, then he's just unanimously voted out, which would have shifted the result of the season massively. Then on to Survivor 41. And in this scenario, I think Deshawn would have been the boot because Heather is very loyal to Erica, so I think she votes alongside her. And Xander, I think Erica will work her magic to control his vote, so with that, Deshawn is unanimously voted out. Next was Survivor 42, and I think the scenario just plays out how it was intended to be, where the players were just trying to get Mike out, and this time because it's a vote, they easily take him out in a unanimous vote. So I think Mike pretty much goes home here. And he just votes for Jonathan because, he's the other big threat and Marianne wasn't really a threat in his eyes. So that I think Mike goes home here. Then 43, it's another one that is pretty easy. I think Jesse would have just been unanimously voted out since he was the biggest threat in the game left. There's really no other scenario would have played out. Jesse would have still been the final 4 boot. Next up is 44, and obviously, Heidi's not going to give up her immunity here. So I think that Carson is on the chopping block, where he's probably unanimously voted out, with Jam Jam and Carolyn flipping on him. I'm not too sold that Carolyn would do so, but considering she has to choose between Jam Jam and Carson already has 2 locked votes against him, she might as well just vote with the majority. So here, Carson is just voted out unanimously. On to Survivor 45, and here I'm a bit mixed on how the scenario would have played out. So my first theory is that Austin and Dee target Katurah since she's the much better player of the 2 battles left, so she's on the firing line. However, she and Jake vote for Austin, and so it ties, which leads to Austin and Katurah having to battle out in fire. But then for my next theory is the fact that Jake does not stick with Katurah and he just votes for her alongside Austin and Dee, making her unanimously voted out. So with that, it pretty much determines that Katurah was on a chopping block this round, no matter if it was a vote or fire. Then we go to Survivor 46, And I think it's another straightforward vote where they were just gonna vote Liz out unanimously since they were under the assumption that she was a huge jury threat. Even though in reality, for some reason didn't see her game and just looked at her as a goat. But anyways, Liz is just the target and is unanimously voted out. However, there is a possibility that she could try and get Kenzie to help her tie the vote against Charlie. But I feel like Kenzie looked at her as a threat as well, so at this point, I'm under the assumption that Liz would have just been voted out. And finally, with Survivor 47, it plays out in a scenario that would have led to a different result in comparison to the actual season, where I think Sam would have been the one that was unanimously voted out, because Rachel and Sue really wanted him gone, and since Teeny was also with them, they would have voted for Sam as well, making him unanimously voted out. So that's pretty much the result of how Survivor 47 would have been without the fire making challenge. So that is it. This wraps up my short coverage on Survivor's infamous forced fire-making twist, which I've gone on a big spiel about how mediocre it has been and most of its downsides that has affected the modern era of Survivor. I do think Survivor did pioneer a twist that just wasn't really working out for the fan base, but yet they still continue to enforce it despite the outrage surrounding it. And I don't think it's going to be going away at some point really at all in the future. But if a miracle does happen and they finally eliminate this twist, it will definitely help reintegrate Survivor back into the path that us fans wanted. And plus, it'll help open up the players to more dynamic gameplay for the final round that will determine the trajectory of the season's endgame. So, I appreciate everyone tuning into this video and just pretty much listening to me discussing about the fire making challenge and how the new twist has just severely impacted Survivor a lot, that has caused it to lose most of its luster in comparison to the older seasons, and the hopes of the twist finally seizing is very unlikely. So yeah, but anyways, I'm appreciative of all of you tuning in.